بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وبعد. So to continue inshallah with al-Fasl al-Awwal from the second book, قواعد العقائد. So Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he gives us a summarized formulation of the framework of theology within Islam, and of course this is abridged. So the original is far larger than this, and the author Sheikh Salih al-Shami, or the muhaddib Sheikh Salih al-Shami, the one who abridged the original Ihya, has basically given us the core components of what Imam al-Ghazali mentions. In the original, he gives us the outline of the Aqidah of Islam, and then he gives us the revelationary proofs from the Quran, and I believe the Ahadith, I can't remember to be honest. And then he goes on to give us the rational proofs, so from mantiq. And he mentions that the third stage, i.e. rational proofs, proofs of logic, philosophical proofs if you like, for the Aqidah of Islam, is not necessary unless a person has been exposed to the philosophies of his time. But there's a point to take into consideration in our time today. We live in a society which the whole outlook is based upon philosophy. The materialistic outlook on life is a philosophical one. Science, mathematics, all of these things previously would have been considered from the philosophical arts. And so with young people, ourselves, we're exposed to philosophy all the time. And we don't necessarily realize it. And so it's important to understand the rational proofs for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence, the philosophical proofs for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence. And it's basic logic. Common sense to some extent. If you have a device, there has to be a creator of that device. You have our universe as it exists, there has to be a creator of that particular existence, i.e. us, our universe, the cohesion and so on and so forth. So last week we looked at al-Asl al-Awwal in relation to the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first pillar is what? Ma'rifatu wujudillahi ta'ala, to know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists, is present. And al-Ghazali, as we started with, al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he started with verses of the Quran, ayat, which all allude to reflection upon the creation. And if we look at Surah Al-Baqarah according to the order of Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, the first direct command that we have is what? Ya ayyuhan nasu ubudu rabbakum alladhi khalaqakum walladhina min qablikum la'allakum tattaqun. O you who O people, worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us the reason. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't say so that you can achieve paradise, so that you can be saved from hellfire. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, الَّذِي خَلَقَكُمْ, the one who created you. وَالَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ, and those who came before you, which is a logical proof to show you that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists. Creation is the rational proof for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence. And it only takes a small amount of consideration and reflection over the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to come to the certainty or the realization that He exists. And so we took the verses إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ until the end of the verse. We took the verse أَلَمْ تَرَوْا كَيْفَ خَلَقَ اللَّهُ سَبْعَ سَمَاوَاتٍ طِبَاقًا and أَفَرَأَيْتُم مَا تُمْنُونَ, although we didn't go into it too much, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, have you considered that which you emit, that which you sow, the conception of the child? And in the conception process of the child alone, there's so much to reflect over. The fact that scientists can tell what the gender of the child is going to be by examining it and so on and so forth, the identifiers and so on and so forth. All of that comes from what? Cohesion. Cohesion must have a creator. There must be, if there is a pattern, there has to be a sustainer of that pattern. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, or al-Ghazali says, قال الله تعالى أفي الله شك فاطر السماوات والأرض. Is there doubt about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? فاطر السماوات والأرض, the inceptor of the heavens and the earth. And I think we asked the question, if we think about it, what's greater in creation? The skies, the heavens, the universe, or man? And we came to the conclusion that man must be greater. Why? Because man can manipulate the skies and the universe. Man can measure, can quantify, can qualify, can travel, and so on and so forth through that magnificent creation, i.e. the heavens, the sky, the stars, and so on and so forth. So just the mind of man alone is greater than the universe. If the mind of man can contain the universe, the mind of man is great. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created man's mind. Upon reflecting over ourselves, then al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, ولهذا بعث الأنبياء صلوات الله عليهم لدعوة الخلق إلى التوحيد ليقولوا لا إله إلا الله. So he says that, and there are differences between prophets in the law that they come with, the commands, the prohibitions that they come with in relation to, for example, penal code, that which is permissible to consume, not to consume, and so on and so forth. But in regards to the main underlying principle of worshipping Allah alone, all of the prophets came with the same message. And al-Ghazali says, for this reason, i.e. The presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the fact that He is only one, and there's all of the indication that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the prophets. He says, li da'wat al-khalqi ila tawheed, to call man, creation, to monotheism, establishing one God, belief in one God, one ilah. لِيَقُولُوا لَا إِلَهَ اللَّهِ, so that they may say there is no God, true God. Because if you look at creation today, especially in our society today, people say they don't believe in a God, but they have established gods. If you ask yourself, a person who believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what is he willing to do? He's willing to sacrifice his time, sacrifice his wealth, sacrifice his health, sacrifice that which he loves, and so on and so forth. Look at people that are in love with money. You can find they do the same things. Are they not worshipping money? There are those that run after the private parts. There are those that run after their stomachs, and so on and so forth. Desire, worshipping desire. There are those that are so arrogant and consumed by their own minds that they worship their minds. Allowing the mind to legislate is a form of placing the mind in the position of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's what's happened today. And the extreme of when you place your mind, your desires, and so on and so forth as your Lord in the driving seat is what we are starting to see today, where the mind starts to question even that which is logical, established through scientific, empirical evidence, and so on and so forth, without going into the detail. And I'm sure many of you can understand. But we are seeing today when desire rules, when the mind rules, catastrophe, chaos ensues. And that's the reality of society that we're living in today. He says, فَإِذَنْ في فترة الإنسان وشواهد القرآن ما يغني عن إقامة البرهان, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed in the fitrah, the innate nature of man. The innate nature of man calls him toward establishing one God. If you look at children don't have any problems accepting God. Children accept God immediately. Why? Because they're closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, i.e. they've just recently come from that realm that we're going back to. And so for them, they can accept Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And man is a logical creature. Man is a logical creature. It makes complete and utter logical sense to believe in a creator. Just as, for example, I said this tablet. If I said this tablet came from nothing, and I believed that, I was convicted in that, then it would be assumed that there's something wrong with my mental health. But yet we can assume that there's no creator for this entire universe. Doesn't make sense. And so children, they have no problem accepting belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in God. And the Prophet ﷺ told us that children, they are Muslims, they are believers. Islam means what? To submit to the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rule, etc. But it's the parents who corrupt them. It's the parents who change them. He says, so in the innate nature of man, وَشَوَاهِدِ الْقُرْآنِ, and the evidences contained within the Quran, the rational proofs that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us to show us His existence in the Quran, he says this is enough to establish Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence, i.e. you don't need to go into the philosophical arguments. But there's a point here for us, and it's not for everyone, but for some, they need to understand the philosophical arguments. There needs to be certain people that have the ability to argue and debate using philosophical arguments, rational proofs, especially if you're dealing with atheists, non-Muslims. You can't go to a non-Muslim and say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists. They say how? And you show them a verse of the Quran. They don't believe in the Quran in the first place. You can use some of the rational proofs contained within the Quran, yes, but you have to have the premises for the argument established prior to the argument. And so it's important to understand how to argue, how to debate. It doesn't mean everyone should do it, because some people, their hearts are like sponges. They very easily soak up everything that they read. And for that problem, philosophy would be a very problematic area to go into. But we live in a time where philosophy is used for everything. And as man, you have to have a philosophy. TV shows are dictated by philosophy. Films are dictated by philosophy. Games are dictated by philosophy. Clothing dictated by philosophy. As everything that we do is dictated by a philosophy. Our philosophy is the philosophy of Islam. So it's important that we have young people, especially, that understand the philosophies of the day, and they are able to address those philosophies, articulate the answer to those philosophies from the Islamic perspective with the language of the philosophers. And when I say philosophers, it doesn't mean philosophical scholars and so on and so forth. No, those who are propagating and so on and so forth. Then he says, al-aslu thani, so the second component, which is crucial to the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, al-ilmu bi-anna Allah ta'ala qadimun lam yazil, azaliyun laysa li wujudihi awwal, bal huwa awwal kulli shay'in wa qabla kulli maytin wa hayy. So to believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to have knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-qadim, lam yazil. So al-qadim, some of the ulama, they would discuss using the word qadim to describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the word, it's the intention behind the word, and it's a word that became used amongst most of the scholars of Ahl Sunnah, whether they were from the Asha'ira or the Hanabila or the Maturidiyya, they would use qadim. You'll find it, for example, in al-Tahawi's formulation of Islamic theology. Qadim meaning there was nothing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pre-eternal. Pre-eternal means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists, has existed, and prior to the creation of time. And it's really important that we understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala transcends time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created time. When you create something in our small capacity that we have to create, you transcend the boundaries of your creation. If you draw a picture, for example, your picture is restricted to that page, 2D. It's not 3D. It can't go beyond the realm within which it has been created. But you transcend the realm of your creation. Likewise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala transcends our realm. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala transcends the boundaries, the laws, the rules, the principles that govern His creation. And this is a very key element to some of the discussions that developed between the ulama. So qadim here means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no beginning. And a person may ask, how can something have no beginning? We don't have the capacity to understand how. Why? Because we're thinking using the principles that govern our realm. We don't have the ability to think beyond that which governs our realm. We don't have the capacity to think beyond it. So when we say, how does something have no beginning? We can't understand. We can't comprehend. What we have to do is accept. And that's what faith is. To believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to accept that which He informs us of Himself. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, هو الأول والآخر والظاهر والباطن, that He is the first, He is the last, He is the that which is manifest and that which is internal. How? Allah knows best. We accept it, we understand it. When I say we understand it, we understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us these things, and that's it. And remember, we mentioned you don't have to necessarily understand something to believe it. To believe it and to be convicted in it, you don't have to understand it. We don't understand how the sirat is going to work. We don't understand what Jannah is like, what Jahannam is like. We have names, we have descriptions which make the meanings closer to our ability to understand. The fruits of Jannah, are they like the fruits of the dunya? No. The life of Jannah, it's eternal. Is it like life here? No. Here, for example, if you were to eat for 1,000 years, you would assume you would become bored. But in Jannah, no. Why? Because it's different. Marriage in Jannah is not like marriage here. Life there is not like life here, but the term life is similar. Life in this dunya and life in the akhirah, we assume the meaning to be similar because we're using a similar term, but that's not the case. So likewise with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we can't understand things about Him. We just have to submit to Him and submit to what He has informed us of Himself, likewise His Prophet. He says, قال الله تعالى هو الأول والآخر والظاهر والباطن. So He is the first, the last, the manifest, and the internal. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows us better than we know ourselves. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is closer to us than our jugular vein. How? Allah knows best, but we know that Allah knows us. Allah sees us. Allah hears us. Allah not only sees us and hears us, but sees and hears every single creation in every single moment at the same time with full clarity and so on and so forth. And not only that, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees and hears that which is manifest and that which is internal. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows our inner thoughts. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows our inner thoughts better than we know ourselves. And that's why, look, the munafiqun in Surah Al-Baqarah, they thought that they were fooling Allah and His Messenger and the believers, but really what? They're fooling themselves. The worst person to lie to is yourself. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows the truth. If I'm being lazy, I'm not coming to salah, I'm doing something I shouldn't be doing, I should admit to myself. I shouldn't try to cover it up. And why? Because eventually I'm going to start to believe my own excuse. And the reality is, Allah knows anyway. There's no hiding from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're only hiding from ourselves. And that's nifaq. That's hypocrisy. And hypocrisy, if we start to believe our own lies, then we can very easily fall into the trap of hypocrisy. So we should be careful. And then he says, al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala, al-aslu al-rabi'. So the fourth component, element of believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence, العلم بأنه تعالى مستوٍ على عرشه بالمعنى الذي أراده الله تعالى بالاستواء. And so this is a contentious issue. The fourth is, so the word مستوى is مستوٍ على عرشه, coming from al-istiwa. So al-istiwa has been a contentious term between the three schools of Islamic theology, Aqidah, for a very long time, or mainly the Hanabila, who have been today labeled as the Athariya, and from them you have a branch which are referred to as the Salafiyya, although they're different from the Hanabila in many aspects. And then you have the Asha'ira and the Maturidiyya, who share similar belief. Al-istiwa, what does istiwa mean? Mustawin ala arshihi. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is upon His throne. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you can say perhaps some of the ulama, they interpret it to be istawla, which means turn to His throne, so on and so forth. But the point of the matter is to believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is upon His throne, or He turned to His throne, depending on the school that you follow. And al-Ghazali says, بِالْمَعْنَى الَّذِي أَرَادَهُ, according to the meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended. If you believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mustawin ala arshihi, you take that term, you believe in it, and you say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what He meant by that, I believe in it, then that's sufficient. This contentious issue is one for the ulama, and it requires an understanding of the Arabic language. It's not an issue for lay people, for the awam. It's not an issue to be debated about by people that don't know how to speak Arabic to a high degree, that haven't studied the basics of Islam. It's not an issue for us, it's an issue for the ulama. And we have issues that are far greater than this particular issue of contention. This is a theoretical issue. It relates to our belief, yes, but there is no real practical implications to this issue. If you turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your times of need, if you turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or you return your strength to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your times of strength, you pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's commands and so on and so forth, then you don't need to worry about these contentious issues. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't want us to know the theory. He wants us to know Him in our lives, the practical. That's the most important thing. And you will hear people that argue about this issue, and you will hear it go to such an extent that some will call others non-Muslims due to their interpretation of this issue. And that's extreme. Those individuals, those groups, they have gone to an extreme, especially if you're doing that in the English language. And there are many scholars that have authored many works on the idea, the notion of calling another Muslim a non-Muslim. For example, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, in a famous compilation of some letters he authored, al-Rasail al-Mardiniyah, he mentions that even if you take the evidences to someone who's pronounced disbelief, like pronounced a statement that is considered to be heresy, in a sense, it's a misinterpretation, it's a mistake, and it's considered to be heresy. He doesn't intend to say a statement of kufr or to do an action of kufr, but the action or the statement can be interpreted as kufr. He says, even if you take the evidences to this person and you establish the evidences for this person, you cannot declare him to be a non-Muslim. Why? Because perhaps he doesn't have the capacity to understand the evidences. So there's a shubha. Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala, in Faisal al-Tafriqa, he discusses the issue of takfir, and he discusses the issue of interpretation. And he mentions there are main schools: Ithbat, Ta'wil, Tafweed being the main three. Ithbat, to give a literal interpretation of the verse; Ta'wil, to give it an interpretation which is assumed to be more befitting; and Tafweed, to say I believe in it according to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended this to mean. Allahu a'lam bi maradihi. He says all three of these, they're valid schools of interpretation. We don't need to argue about these issues. Again, if we look historically, you have greats from the Hanabila who would do Ithbat, literal interpretation of the verses. You have greats from the Asha'ira, Ta'wil, likewise Maturidiyya, or even Tafweed. And then you had greats from the Hanabila and the Asha'iriyya and the Maturidiyya who would engage in Tafweed, saying Allahu a'lam bi muradihi. That's the summary of where these issues, the contentions lie. And the reason for the contentions is a belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and a want to glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and raise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a way which is befitting. The reasons for these contentions, they're not because one party wants to deviate, one party wants to turn away. No, all three schools, they assume that they are following the way of the Salaf, the way of the first few generations, i.e. the Sahaba and the Tabi'een. All three schools. That's where their contention lies. They're disagreeing on what the interpretation of the Sahaba was. So for example, Ibn Taymiyyah from the Hanabila, An-Nawawi from the Asha'ira, Ibn Hajar from the Asha'ira, Ibn Rajab or Ibn al-Qayyim from the Hanabila. How are you going to say that one is right and one is wrong as a layperson? That's not your place. You say the ulama have differed on these issues. I'm a layperson. I'm not going to get involved. What is important to me is my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What's important to me is, am I establishing the prayer? Am I giving sadaqah? Am I doing something for the Muslims and for Islam in this time today? That's the crux of the matter. Bickering and arguing, and even worse, labeling others due to this issue or these issues is a sign of a lack of success. If a person is seeking knowledge and that knowledge is leading that person to labeling others, to calling others innovators, to calling others non-Muslims, to speaking about this group and that group, then that's a sign that there is a corruption somewhere, either in the heart, perhaps in the knowledge that they're seeking. Yes, there can be corruption in the knowledge. It's not to say the knowledge itself is wrong, but a corruption in the way it's being taught, etc. Or it could be a problem even with the teacher. If the teacher is teaching his students to label, to do takfir, tabdi', and so on and so forth, and calling someone an innovator is closet takfir. calling someone, labeling others innovators. This is an innovator, that's an innovator, this is a dal and that's a mudil. This is someone who is following the school of the Khawarij, but they haven't come out of the closet yet. Eventually they will, if they continue in that way. It's extremely dangerous. And brothers that take that path, they don't last very long. And ask anyone that's been studying for longer than a few years, and they'll tell you, they don't last very long, because the heart has not been created to carry such enmity and animosity for others. It's not healthy for the heart, and the heart cannot take it. Eventually, the heart will turn away. And there's a level of arrogance to it as well, because it's like 1 foot in Jannah. I have my foot in Jannah. I can talk about others because I'm following the aqidah of Ahlul Haqq. Who decided that you're Ahlul Haqq? Who gave you the label of the people of Haqq, the people of truth? We don't find out who was correct until the Akhirah, unless someone has received revelation and it's wrong. Would a person assume that they're right and someone like Imam al-Nawawi is wrong? If so, and this person can't speak Arabic properly, then they have arrogance in their heart. Would a person assume that they're right and someone like Ibn Taymiyyah is wrong? If so, and they can't speak Arabic properly, again, arrogance in the heart. Even if they can speak Arabic, but they haven't mastered the sciences that the likes of Ibn Taymiyyah and Nawawi, Ibn Rajab, and so on and so forth mastered, then they have arrogance in their heart. Ibn Hajar, for example, the author of Fath al-Bari, every school of Islam will go back to Fath al-Bari to understand the content of Sahih Bukhari. But then you're going to have students that study that book saying that the aqidah of Ibn Hajar is wrong. That's arrogance of the highest order. Likewise, those who refute and talk about Ibn Taymiyyah. It doesn't matter what school you follow. If you are giving a ruling about other people's aqidah, other people's belief, you have basically given yourself the position of a judge, speaking on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The moment you speak about someone else, on Yawm al-Qiyamah, you're going to stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you're going to be asked about it. Imagine someone said Ibn Taymiyyah's aqidah is corrupt, and Nawawi aqidah is corrupt, Ibn Hajar, Ibn Rajab. Imagine. And by the way, these individuals, they have slight differences in their aqidah that they followed. But imagine on Yawm al-Qiyamah, if Ibn Taymiyyah complained to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala about this poor person, now he's poor, and said, this person accused me of being misguided. What's that person going to say to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Imagine, and Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala, who authored every single science, really, there's a book that we use to understand that particular science in Islam. Imagine someone spoke about his aqidah on Yawm al-Qiyamah. He's going to stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's not just these giants. Likewise, each other. If I speak about someone's aqidah, I'm going to be questioned about his aqidah on Yawm al-Qiyamah. If I call someone a mubtadi', a dal, a mudil, something like that, on Yawm al-Qiyamah, I'm going to be questioned about that. Even worse, if I'm making a video about that person, if I'm spreading videos about that person, spreading WhatsApp messages about that person, typing things up online about that person, all of those things, I am putting myself in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does al-Ghazali say, rahimahullah, in Bidayatul Hidayah? He says, if a person lived his entire lifetime and didn't speak about Iblis, who we all know is going to Jahannam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, he turned away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not only turned away, but he challenged Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to some degree. Al-Ghazali says, if a person did not mention Iblis's name and mention him as an enemy of Allah his entire lifetime, he's not going to be questioned about that on Yawm al-Qiyamah. So why does a person feel that he needs to speak about others? It's a real calamity, and it's a waste of time. And if a person is around those who speak about others all the time, he needs to get away from those people before they destroy him and destroy his deen and destroy his dunya. And believe me, it's happened on many occasions. And then he says, الأصل الخامس العلم بأنه تعالى مرئي بالأعين والأبصار في الدار الآخرة دار القرار. So he says, to know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be seen, he says, في الدار الآخرة, in the next life. And he says here, بالأعين والأبصار. And the difference between أعين and أبصار, between عين and basar, عين is that which is used to see. Basar is sight. So someone can have basira, but they can be blind. They can have sight but be blind. Why? Because they have the ability to perceive the reality of a matter, even though they can't literally see. He's saying in the akhirah, you will see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with both that which is used to see and perception, vision. So he's making it clear that it's actual sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, في الدار الآخرة دار القرار. In the akhirah, which is dar al-qarar. And just that word, there's a lot that can be said about it. Darul qarar. This life, what does that mean? Qarar basically means settle, to settle. The place of settling, the place of settled existence. This life here, it's temporary. It's not real. How many have been with us and they're no longer with us anymore? They're just a memory. And for most of us, all we are ultimately is memories in the lives of others. When we pass away, we're just memories. Everything that we leave behind is going to remain here. We're not taking it with us, except for our actions. Of course, as the Prophet ﷺ said, that's are done for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the next life is Darul Qarar. This life, you will not feel settled. If you're looking for settlement in this life, if you're looking to feel settled, content, happy, you're not going to find it. You're going to be looking for the rest of your life and you won't find it. This life, the Prophet ﷺ said, we're travelers. And when you're traveling, you travel lightly. Anyone that's lived abroad for a small period of time will know what it feels like to be a stranger in a land that's not yours. You don't attach yourself to the land. Why? Because you know eventually I'm leaving this place. You don't allow yourself to become attached because you know eventually I'm leaving this place. You don't settle. But in this dunya, we live as if we're going to be here, settled, attached, and that's problematic for us. We have to live detached from this life to the best of our ability because we are detached in reality and we are going to leave. We are going to leave this place, every single one of us. And right now, we're assuming, that we're the ones that are living on this earth as if it's our earth. Just as those who came before us assume the same thing. Just as those that come after us are going to assume the same thing. No one talks about the people that lived before us in this area. We don't know their names. They're no longer relevant. But in the moment, we feel like we are the relevant people, inhabitants. We are relevant. But the reality is, just like those who came before us, we're irrelevant. And if you think how many of us have existed, i.e. humans, we are nothing. Nothing. How many humans live on the earth today? Over 7 billion. 1 out of 7 billion. We're not much as individuals. And one of the problems of society today, we become very individualistic. We become individualistic. Everything should be manipulated to our desires, to our wants, to our direction. And that's not the Islamic narrative. Our narrative as Muslims is a collective one. That we work for the collective, not for the individual. And that which the collective leaves behind remains. That which the individual leaves behind disappears as soon as the individual leaves. It goes with him. From a business perspective, if you want to set up a good business that runs for a long time, you don't make yourself the sole owner of that business, because what happens when you pass away? The business dies with you. Likewise, as a collective, we don't live as individuals, we live together. And we make our akhirah our priority. We remind ourselves, I'm leaving this place. I'm leaving this place. It could be shortly. It could be, in a few years. It could be Allah gives us a long life. May that be the case as righteous people. But the reality is we're leaving. And every day we're getting closer to that day. What did Hassan al-Basri say? Ya ibn Adam, innama anta ayyam. You're made up of days, O son of Adam. كلما ذهب يوم ذهب بعضك. Every time a day goes, a part of you disappears. It's like the sand device. I forgot what it's called. You turn it upside down, the sand timer. The sand timer. Turn it upside down and the sand's disappearing. That's our lives. The sand is us. And there might be a small amount of us left, but we can't feel it. We feel like there's still a lot of sand in the tank. The reality is there's only a few grains left, a few breaths left. And so if we're not prepared for that, It's going to be a calamity when Malakul Maut is standing in front of us and we're saying, give me a bit more time. There's no more time. Your time is done. You're not coming back. You're just as insignificant now as those who came before you. We need to prepare. That's the reality of this life. This life, we're not here to play, to enjoy, to spend time. And no, we're here for a short period of time, and then we're going to stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and be questioned about what we've done. So what are we preparing for that time? That's the harsh reality. We are going to stand in front of Jahannam. We're going to stand in front of Jannah. And we might assume now, we might, hope for Jannah, but there's a great chance that we could be people of Jahannam. That's a reality. What are we doing about it? When you read Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, the biographies of the earlier scholars, as I've mentioned before, some of them couldn't sleep. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't, even if they wanted to, they couldn't. Why? Because they were so terrified with what was going to come to them after death. Those were individuals that truly understood the reality of this life. We leave the masjid and we forget about what we've heard, including myself. We leave the masjid and we go back to enjoying the dunya. But a day will come, it will be our last day. An hour will come, it will be our last hour. A minute will come, our last minute. How many brothers, sisters passed away and they didn't know? They didn't plan, they didn't write into the diary, I'm going to die today. They left their houses in the morning, they didn't return in the evening. They left behind family members that were crying over their deaths. And when you think about it, you feel bad for the family, but you should feel worse for the dead person, because now he's facing reality. Abu Bakr, what did he say? He said that I wish I didn't exist. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, one of the Mubashirin bil Jannah, someone who Allah has promised paradise for. He said, I wish that I didn't exist, because he didn't want to face judgment. So we have to think about it as much as possible. Prepare ourselves. Try to prepare ourselves. At the very least, do the fara'id and stay away from the muharramat. At the very least. And then he says, he mentions the verse, قال الله تعالى وجوه يومئذ ناظرة إلى ربها ناظرة, that there are faces glowing on that day, يوم القيامة, إلى ربها ناظرة. Those who are looking at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're going to be glowing in happiness and so on and so forth. He says, ولا يرى في الدنيا تصديقا لقوله عز وجل لا تدركه الأبصار وهو يدرك الأبصار. He says, as for the dunya, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be seen. He won't be seen. And anyone who claims to have seen Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this dunya is one of two things, either deluded or a liar, simply. He's either deluded himself. If he believes he's seen Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's either deluded himself or he is a liar, a charlatan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be seen in this dunya. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, لا تدركه الأبصار, that sight in this life, we don't even have the capacity with our sight to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're not able to. وهو يدرك الأبصار. And he encompasses all visions. Our vision cannot encompass him, but he encompasses all visions. And he says, لقوله تعالى في خطاب موسى عليه السلام لن تراني. When Musa عليه السلام said to Allah, let me see you, Ya Rabbi. And what did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? لن تراني. You will not be able to see me. Lan in the Arabic language means never. It's not possible. If someone says لن تذهب, it means you're not going to go at all, never. لن تراني means you will not. It's not possible. It's impossible for you. We can only see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the akhirah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from those that see him. Then he says, Al-Aslu Sadis, العلم بأن الله عز وجل واحد لا شريك له فرد لا ند له انفرد بالخلق والإبداع واستبد بالإيجاد والاختراع وبرهانه قوله تعالى لو كان فيهما آلهة إلا الله لفسدتا. So he says the final component pillar of belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence is to know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and when he says al-ilmu, what does he mean by that? Al-ilmu, it's to have conviction, to have such conviction that you know. Just as I know that this pillar is made of bricks, I know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one. Just as I know that there is ground beneath me, I know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created me. That's what he means. It's to know an unwavering certainty, Even if a person were to try to convince me and were to bring me every evidence that they could possibly bring me, it won't waver me. Why? Because I know. And of course, I'm not speaking about myself. I'm saying, I hope that to be the case, but I'm saying that's what he means. When he says al-ilm, he means it's to know. If I were to try to convince you now that this pillar made of bricks is made of gold, none of you would believe me. That's the type of knowledge that he's talking about, certainty, certain knowledge. And that type of knowledge is something that the ulama, they discuss in usul al-fiqh. And al-Ghazali, he mentions in al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, which I've recommended for you to read many times. He says that true certain knowledge is something that's gifted to a person by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's attained through worshipping him. You can't attain certain knowledge of him except through worshipping him.